Steve, I think this one's for you, but Loren, maybe you want to take this one as well. Steve, you mentioned some of the alternatives to deterrence, and one of them that I'm not sure if you mentioned this. Deterrence, for me, is, yes, it's a relationship, but it's a holding action. I like to think of it as a holding action that prevails until whatever political conditions allow for some sort of reconciliation between the two opponents. It was a holding action during the Cold War until perestroika and glasnost. Maybe it's going to be a holding action now between us and Moscow until something changes. But one of the possible alternatives, I suppose, to deterrence is some form of, I don't know, détente or accommodation in which, and Loren, you got into this when you mentioned foreign policy, down at the Canadian Forces College, they had a definition of security and foreign policy, and one of the bits of it was the art of reconciling your vital interests with the vital interests of others, because others do have vital interests. And we probably know what they are. We probably know what they want. Is one of the alternatives to deterrence some sort of accommodation or détente? And if so, what does that cost us?
That's a really great question. I think things like deterrence and containment, lasted 70 years, so that's great. But they were, in some ways, a tough 50 years. Sorry, it was a tough 50 years or so. And so it would have been nice to have tried something, and they did try things. They tried détente, but we didn't stop deterring during détente, right? The funny thing is, when do we stop deterring? I'd say it was in the aughts when we pulled all the tanks, or even the teens when we started pulling all the tanks out of Europe. Right, 2013, 2014 was when we started to see the last American tanks in Europe. And so that's why I have a hard time swallowing the blame NATO for Russia's behavior thing, because yes, things were going funky in Ukraine, but on a strategic balance level, there was no conventional threat to Russians in 2014. It was a political threat. Which gets to the big problem, which is how do you reconcile? The realists, or at least one loud realist would say, give them a hunk of Ukraine, right? Make Ukraine a big buffer zone. Which is great, as long as you don't believe in democracy and self-determination and Helsinki and all other kinds of cool things that we kind of believe in and have served us really well. So I would love to reconcile. And I do think that at some point that's possible, particularly with the Chinese, who will be in a strong footing to come up with some sort of deal, although the whole Taiwan thing is the real challenge, so putting that aside. But the Russians are harder because they're losing. There was a discussion about demographics yesterday. Big losers in the demographic future, the Russians. So they're gambling for resurrection today. And I do not want to try to reconcile with an inveterate gambler. So that's a real trick. So I think deterrence has to be the order of the day with the Russians, and I don't think we can get out of that. I think what we can do is try to reduce the costs of their gray zone behavior. We can try to reduce our vulnerability to that. We can try to become more resilient. We can try to impose costs, but I don't think we can deter it, because I don't think we can cause sufficient pain. Oh, we actually are causing heaps of pain, but it doesn't seem to be sufficient. What is going on with the Russian economy these days? So, there's the politics of it. Can we cause enough harm to Putin's political standing that he changes his behavior, right? This is the problem facing the Canadians right now. Can the Canadians harm enough congressional districts that Congress acts and does stuff to constrain Trump? There's a clear pathway for that between the United States and Canada, which will ultimately lead to reconciliation. Maybe. But there's a whole lot more political accountability in the American Congress than there is in the Russian political system. And so you can reconcile with some folks and maybe not with others.
The only point I would add to that is in considering reconciliation, I have doubts about our track record to actually believe or understand what Russia's interests are, because we tend to tell ourselves a lot of fairy tales about what their intentions are, whether or not they're willing to change, whether or not we should actually believe them when they say that, like, no, we really do want you to stay out of Ukraine, and no, we really do want NATO expansion to cease over here, and if it doesn't, we're going to have big problems with that. The persuasive arguments over time have not seemed to be terribly effective. So I think it's a perspective worth considering. It's just more of to me, a problem of making sure we're not telling ourselves fairy tales at night about what exactly are Russian and Chinese intentions, what are their goals, what are their interests, and not mirror imaging ourselves onto them in doing so. I don't necessarily think that's a viable path in many instances, but it is a useful exercise in really forcing ourselves to face up to here's what appear to be their objectives, and in a lot of cases believing what they say when they say here's what our intentions are.
So, Hugh, you talked about, and I agree with you, the importance of looking again at what is it that we're willing to fight for? What really are our interests, and what's our role in the world, and all those good things. Loren, you talked. I just kept nodding. Yes, so I've been there, done that. All the ways that it's difficult to get our national leaders to talk about those really difficult issues, to focus on what's the big picture, where are we really going, not just the crisis of the moment. That's really hard. How do you, this is your essay question. Discuss, please. How do you get from there to there?
This is a very unreassuring answer. Country, in the end, the way any country, big or small, relates to the rest of the world depends ultimately on how it sees itself. And perhaps that's more true of the United States than of any other country. And so the United States has actually, through its history, quite often changed the way it saw itself as it changed the way it related to the rest of the world. And the big question that confronts America today is whether or not it changes the way it sees its role from the role it thought it had acquired at the end of the Cold War, a role of essentially unchallenged global preponderance. The question is whether it's going to cling to that role and is willing to do what it takes to bear the burdens and pay the costs required to do that in the face of adversaries as formidable as Russia and China. And for what it's worth, I think China is far more formidable than Russia. I think China is a uniquely formidable adversary. If the United States is going to try and preserve its role in Asia in the face of what seems to me to be a very determined China with an ambition not to be a globally dominant power, so it's not like the Soviet Union, but to be the dominant power in East Asia, if America is going to preserve its vision, which is of its global role, which is incompatible with that, then it's going to have to muscle itself up, gird its loins to face an adversary which is in some ways more formidable than the Soviet Union was, because its economy is bigger, much, much bigger than the Soviets was. And in the end, countries do that. They do that redefinition through political leadership. Political leaders stand up and say, we used to do this and now we're going to have to do that. Or we used to do this and we're going to have to keep on doing that. Now, I don't want this to be a low blow on behalf of our Canadian hosts at the US political system, but that would be hard under any political leadership. But one of the reasons why the present peculiarities of American political leadership are so significant historically is that the present political leadership in the United States, well, certainly the executive leadership, seems uniquely ill-placed to conduct that conversation. Remarkably ill-placed to conduct that conversation. And, I'll be absolutely blunt with you, as a cautious ally, and an ally that has a very different kind of question here than Canada does, because after all the United States is a rifle shot away, not the case for us, we have to make a prudent judgment as to whether we can credibly expect the United States political system to deliver the leadership required for the United States to answer the questions that Loren put on the table exactly correctly. And if it doesn't, then I would say the chances of the United States finding a way to build the national consensus required to sustain deterrence is relatively low. And that's a very gloomy conclusion to draw. And just for the record, and not because I wouldn't want it to happen, nobody likes American global primacy more than Australians, let me tell you. Partly because we are a bit further away. But it's, that is the challenge.
So I'm also pessimistic, unfortunately, but remain hopeful because this is something I work on a day-to-day basis in terms of getting Americans to talk about what it is worth fighting for. Because in 2011, 2012 at West Point, President Obama told the world that the tides of war are receding. And unfortunately, Americans believed him. And yes, we did pull out substantially from Afghanistan and Iraq in the time period that followed. But Americans since then lost track of, in a significant way, of not only what commitments America has in Iraq and Afghanistan, but also in Africa, also in East Asia, in Europe, and elsewhere. I remember last year when the Moab, the mother of all bombs, was set off in Afghanistan, there were Americans who quite seriously said, we're still in Afghanistan? I had no idea. And similarly, when 4 soldiers were killed in October in Niger last year, members of Congress who sit on the Senate Armed Services Committee and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee said, I had no idea that we had soldiers who are in any way at risk in Niger. So to me, the question of getting Americans to have the conversations about what is worth fighting for is going to have to start with the premise of being far more transparent from a government perspective about where we're already fighting, and then from there being willing to engage in conversations that none of us really want to have about to what degree has that really been worth it and successful and impactful in the way that we continue to say. In Afghanistan, we have now turned the corner 17 times. I'm waiting for the 18th. And in this administration, we have gone from being, kind of transparent about saying where U.S. forces are deployed and the number of drone strikes that we take, and when Americans are injured or killed overseas, to being not transparent about it at all. It's the Pentagon has, so Secretary Mattis has said quite directly that there are times when he will not share troop deployments with Congress because it may impact operational security, which has never really seemed to in the past, so I'm kind of questioning whether or not that's actually the case. There are times when we have not shared any details at all about where Americans were killed overseas because of, frankly, embarrassment by the department about its ability to protect men and women there. So those things freak the hell out of me because that tells me that we're not willing to open up as a nation right now with our, by comparison, somewhat smaller security commitments. If it gets a lot harder, it's going to be a lot more difficult to have the conversation with Congress, the American people, about this is that we're going to have to take far bigger risks, and we are going to have to spend a lot more dollars, and we may have to send a lot more people overseas, and no one seems to want to do that. Congress in particular, and my last point here, has not wanted to have an authorization of use of military force debate, a real one, since 2002. Yeah. And the number of groups that we continue to be at war with since that time has grown by a huge number, and they are not something that we have actually debated. So I'm pessimistic, but I'm also fired up. And this is something that I work on every day to get people to pay attention to. If we want to have a conversation about our interests and what we're willing to fight for, we need to admit what we're doing right now.
Hello, still Brian Cox, still a student at Queen's Law. So just want to kind of bring the conversation to a specific topic. It's actually come up a couple of times in the conference, but something we've identified as kind of a regional, at least, if not global, security threat, and that's the alleged interference by Russia in Western elections. So we've identified it as a potential security threat. But it doesn't seem that we really have our shit together for like getting a response. So we've talked about deterrence, but it doesn't seem that so credibility seems to be an issue there for a deterrent in a response. Does deterrence have a credible place in keeping Russia from engaging in that type of behavior? And if not, is there something besides deterrence that we can actually get our shit together?
I was going to chime in on the previous conversation, and the same answer applies here, which is polarization is killing the American political system. It used to be, I'm in the middle of a project where I compare the world's democracies and the role of their legislatures and how they do oversight over the armed forces. And polarization has destroyed not entirely destroyed, but has done a lot of damage to the ability of Congress to do oversight. And that's really important because I think in democracies you shouldn't just have oversight being done by two people, the prime minister and the defense minister. And so in the project, the U.S. in an idealized capacity is at one end of the spectrum. May not be the best part of the spectrum, but it's a better part of the spectrum than, where Canada is, where the parliament is utterly irrelevant. And the challenge here is that to deal with the Russian election interference, you'd expect to see some energy on par with the Benghazi hearings. Because the stakes were, instead of 4 guys who were killed in Benghazi, which is important, I don't want to dismiss it, pales in comparison to whether we can have elections that have results that are what the American people want, right? It doesn't get any bigger than that, really, is can we have independent elections and have them not messed around with by our adversaries? Now, the answer is the adversaries will try. Guess what? The United States has done this to other countries in the past, right? But yes, we can be hypocritical and say, we really hate it when it happens to us, and we don't want it to happen. And so it'd be nice to see a political conversation where we actually make progress on this. But that's not going to happen because one party is implicated. And so it's going to be until you have some significant political change, which would be a change in who is the majority in the House and who's the majority in the Senate, you're not going to get the kind of investigations that you used to get. The Republicans probably threw some bodies in the way in Watergate. I don't remember because I was alive but not paying that much attention. Well, the New York Times was around my house. I wasn't reading it. But there was some Republicans who were like, this is a problem. And ultimately it was Barry Goldwater going to the President Nixon going, this is going to look bad for you. And that's when he resigned, right? We show no sign of the Republicans these days taking seriously this threat to America. And until that happens, or until they're wiped out in the election of 2020, which may or may not happen, because again, they're winning, their win last year is leading to huge changes, not for today, tomorrow, but for the next 25 to 50 years, which is the courts, right? Yeah, this week, the court said, hey, voter suppression, go for it. This is a problem. These are really deep changes, and it's going to be hard to bounce back from. And this matters for our national security, because if we can't have a bipartisan consensus about fending off Russian interference in the elections, because during the Cold War, what worked was there was bipartisanship. Not perfect ones, but there was bipartisanship. We need to thwart the Soviet Union. These are the things we have to do. And by the way, it means roads and bases and all these other good things we got. But they agreed to it, more or less. And they shared, and it was sharing information with Congress. There wasn't no the SecDef saying to Congress, well, I'm not going to tell you because I don't trust you. Mm-hmm. That's ridiculous. Now, it happens in other democracies, but we shouldn't be other democracies. The United States should be better than that. It used to be probably a little bit better than that. And this is a real problem. And so until we get that done, until we have the Congress and the President of the United States agree that something bad happened and confront it, then no, it's not going to change. We're going to be as vulnerable to it. How do we confront the Russians on interfering for elections? We first have to stop using the word alleged. Right? It happened. We don't need a smoking gun because we saw the gun. It was on, the president said, or the political candidate said at the time, Russians, find these emails, please release them for us. And anybody who doesn't believe that WikiLeaks is a cutout for the Russians, well, I can't convince you much else. And so we're at where we're at right now. And that's going to make it, there are things we can do in the world. That is going to require real political change at home before we do anything close to it.
I'll just make one comment on that. So people always criticize the micromanagement of the Obama administration. One thing we did exceptionally well was message discipline, because we could micromanage the crap out of that. In that if you ever had, so I think last week, 2 weeks ago, the Director of National Intelligence has made a series of statements about the future Russian threat, but also about the investigations that they have done about what the Russians did in 2016. All very much diametrically opposite of what the president himself and others in the administration have said. If we had ever had a situation in the Obama administration where you had different cabinet level or National Security Council level officials saying different things about threats to the United States, Ambassador Rice would have lost her mind and then been on the phone with them in 4 seconds. We would have known about it right away. It would have been a problem. We would have addressed it immediately. There would have been 79 process stories about how we had this one issue, and then it would have been done. We would have moved on. The absence of this in this administration fascinates me. They do not care at all that they disagree with each other all of the time. There's nobody seeking message discipline. It's only the tweets, the 280 characters from the president that seem to kind of set policy some days, and they change the next day. But that as a process nerd has remained the weirdest thing about this administration to me, that they can be, it's like they can basically all run their own government without, if the president is not paying attention. If he is, then they may get fired.
Hugh, would you like the last word?
Well, look, on that subject, I mean, I think the points have been made are absolutely right, but let me just go back to the first question, because in the end, you know, it does sort of pull all of this together. The in the end, deterrence never stops, because you're always, unless you withdraw completely, which is of course an option for the United States, withdraw to the Western Hemisphere, but unless you withdraw completely, you're always going to be trying to impose boundaries on the conduct of other great powers, and deterrence is going to be a part of how you impose those boundaries. And the big trick is how you negotiate that. Now, one of the boundaries you want to negotiate with Russia, and I would suspect with China too, is don't interfere too much in our internal affairs, and we won't interfere too much in yours. I do think that often deterrence works best when there's a certain symmetry about it. So at the risk of sounding a little bit cynical and aggressive, I think the best way to deter Russia from interfering in American elections is to do what you can to interfere in their domestic political processes. I wouldn't say their elections, because I think they're past interfering with, so to speak, but or at least Putin already does a very good job of managing them. But I do think that kind of symmetry can be quite effective.